A simple boot. I'm going to start with the standard cylinder. So I'm going to click on cylinder, left click and drag it out, and then hit T to edit the cylinder. I'm going to hit P to enter perspective. I often like to work in perspective, except for when I'm using the trim, the slice, or the curve brush. So right now this thing is still, I can't sculpt on it. If I hit X, I do like to hit X right away to see if I'm looking kind of at the front of the mesh. So I usually like to have my kind of sense of orientation with the model right away. Makes it a lot easier and more effective to work in. So start with the cylinder. I'm going to keep it fairly simple. So I'm going to go into the initialize panel, which is on the lower right side. So drag out a cylinder, get into edit mode, which is T on your keyboard. So I'm going to restore the standard UI. There we go.
We need to make that a polymesh before we do that.
No. So I'm actually not going to make polymesh yet. I'm going to just do some basic edits. So before just like going into sculpting mode right away, I actually want to just simplify the mesh a little bit. So I'm going to give it a few less divisions, maybe like 16 height divisions and maybe 16 vertical divisions. And while you're in here too, you can have, again, more precise, more controlled scale properties. So for X, I'm going to set it to 50, X size, and Y size, I can set it to 50. So that is okay. You can also make this, shorter or taller, but I'm okay with this sort of height on the object so far. Again, this is just going to be like a very, very rough, cartoony looking sort of boot. So what we can do with this is we can also, if you wanted to, you can make it a tube as well, but again, I'm just going to deal with a solid cylinder for now. What I do want to do is use the taper top, so I want it to sort of taper in a little bit, like a boot would. Yeah. Yeah, so what I want to do is actually flip this object so the cone is kind of tapering towards the bottom. So in that case, I can go to deformation and go to mirror, but in this case, I'm going to turn off the little X switch and turn on the Y switch, and I'm going to hit mirror, which is going to flip it upside down. So technically right now, this mesh is not sculptable, right? If you try to click on it with a standard brush, it'll give you that warning. So you do have to go into the upper right part of the tool panel or tool palette and click on Make Polymesh 3D. So click on that, and it's going to, if you have the polyframe enabled, which is that button, or Shift F, then you'll see the wireframe go from maybe just like black and gray to a color. So this is what's known as a polygroup, right? So polygroups you can create in a variety of ways. I'll come back to this in a minute though, because we're going to do a few more things. We're going to do, like I said, a cartoony looking sort of boot. Something very, very simple, very basic. So next up, we can do one of two things. We can add just a sphere to this, or do an insert mesh. So I'm going to show you one way first. If I go to Subtool, okay? Inside of Subtool, you can click on a button called Append. So that's down here, Append. Okay? So what that allows you to do is actually add other mesh you've created into this particular Z tool, or just a basic sphere. So if I click on this sphere, it'll add it into the scene, right? Now, because my initial subtool was a polymesh, I made it editable, sculptable. This tool is automatically made into a polymesh as well. Okay? So what I'm going to do is just kind of drop the sphere down, maybe scale it down a bit. So this will be like kind of the toe of the boot, right? So already you kind of get a sense of maybe where the project is going. Subtool palette, by the way, is just like a Photoshop layer, so you can turn off and on visibility of certain like meshes or tools. And you want to make sure you select the tool that you actually want to move around and edit, right? So I can move the sphere, but not the cone. If I go to the cone or the cylinder, I can move that over as well. In this case, I'm moving the sphere, so I'm going to move it to this position, roughly. So I want it just sort of out in front of the boot or the leg.
Can we snap it to the center, by the way?
Yeah, you can. I think if you hold Shift, it'll sort of snap to either the points or sort of to the grid. Yeah. Anyway, so I'll move this close by. I'm going to turn off perspective. So I'm doing this in preparation for something. The preparation is this, is that I'm going to cut the bottom half of the sphere off, okay? Now, keep in mind, if you take a look, I'm actually, if I'm in symmetry, my boot's actually facing the wrong way. So I think what I want to do, I'm going to hit X to turn off symmetry and make sure my sphere is on this side, sort of facing forward again, right? So if I hit X and see my symmetry, I should see the two dots. So it's always good to be aware of, you know, where your center point is, where your pivots are. And again, I've got perspective turned off because I want to create a nice clean line. If I do this in perspective, it'll create a line that's not totally flat on the bottom. So I'm going to go to B for brush, and I'm going to go to T for trim. So there's something called the trim curve. It's right here. So that trim curve, if I click it, it's going to tell you when you hold Control Shift, this will be the new selection brush. So trim brushes, slice brushes, and clip curve brushes all will activate Control Shift, or will be accessible through Control Shift, but it'll often give you that warning. If you want to ignore the warning or just like tell it to hide away, you can say skip this until next restart. For me, I just want to say OK.
Which brush was that?
B for brush, T for trim, and it's going to be trim curve. So what happens now is if you hold Control Shift, that trim curve brush will be activated. You'll see it in the upper left corner of ZBrush, right? And if you drag it out, it actually will slice the mesh off.
From this selected subject.
Yes. Now these slice brushes, by the way, they, like many things in ZBrush, are a little weird, a little unusual. So if you Control Shift, click and drag from left to right, the shading is on the top side of the line, which means whatever's on that top side will be sort of sliced off. But if you go right to left, that line will be on the bottom side. That shading will be on the bottom side, which means it'll cut the bottom off. And the same thing kind of goes. If you go from below to above, the shading's on the left. If you go from above to below, it'll be on the right. This is something that you will kind of develop a second nature for, I guess, over time. But I'm going to slice that bottom off.
Also, sir, how did you get
This is when I turn off perspective, is when I need to do a clean cut that's like nice and clean through the model. You want to turn off perspective so it doesn't kind of go off on a weird angle. Okay. Thing like is getting that viewport straight, so that's turning off perspective. When you left click and drag, hold shift and it'll snap to kind of a side view. If you're rotating near a front type view, hold shift, it'll snap. So it's very important. Now these two are roughly touching. I will now start using traditional sculpting brushes. So I'm going to hit B for brush, M for move, and find the move brush. So now what we can do, maybe from a top or bottom view, is just move that sphere back and over. So it's, you know, roughly fitting that shape. And again, this is just going to be simple and cartoony, just so we can establish some principles, right? Now, one thing I want to mention, I'm going to just turn off the floor as well. When we did the trim brush, it cut off that part of the sphere, but it also made a new group, a polygroup. So that's just a different color coding, okay? You just want to make sure when you use the move brush, use a large enough brush so you can kind of quickly and easily move things around. Because if you use a very, very small brush and you're like moving a ton of points at once, it can get very kind of messy and ugly very quick, right? It can start to look really gross. So big, simple moves, right? And you can even use that move brush. I use the move brush a ton. When I'm laying out a shape, a design, or whatever, I use it all the time. So if I want to like flatten the foot and maybe make it slope out and down a little bit or look a little different, right? So I can kind of go in and do some rough shaping that way. Now it doesn't matter. You can sort of see if the foot gets pulled off in a strange direction, that's okay. If you need to move the whole thing down, you can move the whole thing down and maybe move it back a bit. That's also fine. Notice as you're working that you know, sometimes the bottom and stuff gets warped. So there's that bottom polygroup. So what's great about polygroups, there's a bunch of reasons it's great. Number one is that you can actually isolate a polygroup just by Control Shift clicking on it, and it'll hide the other polygroups that weren't clicked on. If you Control-Shift click on it again, it hides that group and unhides the other part. So if you want to just move the top of the boot without affecting the bottom, you can do that. Now, another little trick to this is if you use the Move, Scale, Rotate, Move, Scale, or Rotate, the gizmo, and you Control-Tap on it, you see it'll actually, let me switch to another material that makes it easier to see, the skin shade, right? So if I clear this, if I Control-Shift click on that group, it'll mask everything but the group. If I Control-Click off of it, it flips that masking around. So the bottom is now masked, right? So the bottom is masked, but the top is editable and sculptable. So polygrouping is very powerful in that sense. You can sort of say, okay, this is like the bottom of the shoe, the bottom of the boot. This is the top of the boot, okay? Next up, let's say I want to sort of flatten this out, right? Because I sort of lost a bit of that flatness when I moved the foot around. If you Control-Tap, so Control-Tap once with the gizmo on that bottom piece, you can scale it flat. You can also move it down if you want with the gizmo. So I'll go back over that. Like I said, not in the draw mode where I've got the move brush, let's say, but if I go to W, E, or R and Control-Click on that bottom group, I should be able to, move it down. If I want to really flatten it out, I can use the scaling just on the Y-axis or that vertical axis, and that'll create a nice flat base to the shoe. You can also hold Control while that area is unmasked and everything else is masked. If you hold Control, you can actually extrude out that way too. Right? So if I Control, Move, Control, Move, Control, Move, you get these extrusions. So that is actually one unique way you can quickly extrude an area. In this case, I just want to flatten the base, so I've undone it and just pulled it down and just scaled it flat. Okay? Yeah, if you want to center the gizmo, you can Alt-click on the polygroup, or you can go Alt and click on the Home button, which will actually center it to the whole thing. So that's a way you can... What we need to do next. So what I want to do is actually merge these two parts, kind of the leg or the height of the boot with the base of the boot. And I've got two separate subtools, right? So this tool up top, I'm going to select it, and under the subtool palette, that's basically one of the first rollouts below the main part of the tool palette is subtool, and you can merge together. Like Photoshop layers, you can split them apart. Under the split menu, you can merge them together through merging. And there's a couple other features we'll come to later on, but I'm going to merge down. So technically it becomes one tool. Now you notice, right, the cylinder is its own polygroup. It's got its own color coding. So when you hit Shift F, you'll see one color for the cylinder, another color for the base of the shoe, and then another color for the sole or the bottom of the shoe. So what's great about this is that even though it's sort of technically one piece of mesh, it's still not attached together. So I can Control-Shift-Click on one part to hide it, Control-Shift-Click on it again to hide that part and unhide the rest, or Control-Shift-Click off the model to make sure everything is visible.
Wait, so how did you merge them?
Yeah, again, that was just going into merge and merge down. So I selected the topmost subtool and went to merge down.
Okay, and then
Hiding and unhiding different polygroups. So there's other ways to make polygroups as well, right? So let's say if I go, right now my Control-Shift brush is that trim curve brush, but by default it's actually something called Select Rectangle, which is this brush right here. So by default, when you first open up ZBrush, if you don't activate a trim brush or a slice brush or a clip curve brush, what it allows you to do is hide or unhide parts of the mesh, like so, by holding Control-Shift. So I will explain a little bit more about how to activate these polygroups. So one way we did it is by trimming off the bottom, and part of the feature of that brush is that it creates a polygroup wherever it slices or trims behind. If you want to maybe make a new group for the top, Control-Shift, click and drag so only the top polys are visible, and you simply need to hit Control-W. Control-W is a shortcut to basically generate a new polygroup.
wait, so Control-Shift? Okay.
So what I did first, just to cover that again, is went B for brush, S for select, because the default Control-Shift brush is actually a selection or visibility brush, which is Select Rectangle. I wish it was Select Lasso because I think it's actually better, but Select Rectangle. And so, if you wanted certain polys to be visible and you wanted to make that a group, you just make that visible, Control-W makes it a new group. Now, I'm not going to do that just yet for that part, but I did do it for the top of this cylinder, okay? So I Control, Shift, click, and drag. So that's a bit of a weird one I find that is confusing. So Control activates masking type brushes, and there's a bunch more just besides the pen. Control Shift will load a category of slicing, cutting, clip curve brushes, and selection brushes. Shift actually has more than one smoothing brush. So there's actually a whole sort of separate library of different types of smoothing. One that only smooths the little crevices and valleys of a sculpt, and one that smooths off the peaks or the high points of a sculpt. Others that smooth things much more aggressively. I can hit Control W. Oops. Yeah. So I can hit Control W to keep making different colors. So sometimes, you know, ZBrush will make two polygroups next to each other that look almost the same, but they're just a slightly different color. So sometimes I will have to go in and, like, you know, isolate that polygroup by hitting Control Shift click and then hitting right Control W until it's just different enough. So polygroups important for a lot of reasons, and we'll see why in a few more minutes. Okay, so everybody should be here. So what I want to do next, technically these mesh are separate, right? So if I use the move brush, even though it may look like they're together, they're just overlapping mesh. So we looked a little bit earlier at just like the pre-built spheres and cubes, and then like the Dynamesh sphere. Well, you can Dynamesh your own stuff, right? So Dynamesh, what it allows you to do is merge floating mesh like this. Even though it's one subtool, there's technically two pieces of floating mesh, and you Dynamesh them together, like so. So it becomes a single solid surface that is sculptable, paintable. Okay? Yep, so I'm going to go back, and all I did is I went into the, again, geometry, the main geometry panel, Dynamesh, and there's a Dynamesh button. And now it makes it a single solid surface. Thing to mention is that Dynamesh, when this mode, basically it's a mode, right? So when that mode is active, okay, you can actually, if you have a mask anywhere and you Control, click, and drag off the model, it clears the mask. Now that there's no mask, if you Control, click, and drag again, it will re-Dynamesh the model. So you have to keep that in mind, okay? So I do want to show you something else. So let's say I want to sort of plan for a tongue in the boot. So I'm going to hold Control, Shift, and left click on that top polygroup I made twice so I can hide it. And then I'm going to use the mask pen tool, let's say, and draw. Now this doesn't have to be perfect, and of course I'm drawing with a mouse, so this is definitely not going to be perfect, but I'm going to just sort of trim this down so I've got what would look like a boot tongue, right? So you can actually create polygroups via masking as well. Okay? So if I create that mask, I'm going to hit Control W. So that actually makes a new polygroup. By the way, if you ever want to hide the lines, you can just click on the little line option so you can just see more of the polygroups than the mesh. So again, I just simply held Control and brushed in the tongue, and if you need to subtract, you hold Control Alt, right? Because Alt is often a negative of whatever brush you're using. You know, if you ever, when you're learning ZBrush, if you're ever in trouble, try Control or Control Shift or Shift or Alt. Usually it'll kind of give you some new function that you didn't think of before, but so yeah, I'm basically just painting in the tongue, hitting Control W, which gives me a new group. And then Control Shift click off of that to unhide everything. Okay, so you guys will have something like this. Now, I may want to color code it a little differently so it's a little bit easier to read, right? So I can isolate it, and there we go. Yeah, so that's the thing, like whether you have visibility, so if I hide or unhide parts of the mesh and hit Control W, that gives me a new group. Or if I paint, let's say I paint something up here. There we go, paint that. And Control W, that will give you a new group there, okay? So you can do it via visibility, creating new polygroups, or by masking, okay? I'm going to go into detailed sculpting, but I do want to show you guys the power of this. So Dynamesh is great, right, for taking simple shapes, merging them together, figuring out a base shape for an object, and doing very conceptual work. And let's say we want to then get into more mechanical or more technical, more specific and accurate modeling. Well, what's great about this is that if we turn off Dynamesh, so when you're past, let's say, the conceptual phase, this is something I commonly do. Turn off Dynamesh, and a couple little panels below, so below Dynamesh, there's Zremesher, okay? And we can use polygroups. You can say, I want to keep the groups and make a new organized model based on this. So we're going to do that next. I'm going to turn off Adapt as well. I'm not going to explain every button, but I will sort of try to show you the best method. And right now my poly count, it's kind of high. It's 33,000. Let's say I want my target poly count to be roughly 2,500. So this is in thousands of polys, so you set your target poly count, and then you can simply hit Zremesh. So it's going to use those color-coded groups to try to make a cleaner, more organized model. Now, if your sculpt, I should mention, if your sculpt is asymmetrical, which mine I think is slightly asymmetrical, and you Zremesh with symmetry on your brush, it will make a new symmetrical boot, and in this case it's giving me a weird bumpy boot. So I'm going to turn off symmetry and Zremesh. So turn off symmetry on whatever brush you have active, and there we go. So it will not use it as a guideline for the new topology, and you will also lose your groups. So now I can also remesh a remesh if I like. So I can say, let's keep the same poly count or maybe half the poly count. So let's try half Zremesh. Yeah, and it looks like it's sort of losing some of the polygroup information. So I'm going to just say keep it the same and Zremesh again. Yeah, being a little bit goofy, but sometimes too, smoothing groups, if you turn the smoothing down to 0, that can actually help sometimes. Yeah, it's being a little strange, I guess. So, but I'm going to just sort of push ahead for now. So if I ever need to reestablish a group, this is when I would go into the brush menu, go to B for brush, S for select. In my own custom shortcuts, I have the select lasso mapped to the number 9 key. So what that allows me to do very quickly, Control Shift Alt, right? Because remember, Alt is a negative. Control Shift allows me to make this visible. Control Shift Alt allows me to hide off parts of a mesh. So I can actually, right, go in and very quickly clean up the grouping issue and hit Control W. There we go. And you do have to be careful. You can see there's some mesh left behind. One of the other weird things about ZBrush is that mesh, as seen from the inside, is invisible. So if you ever run into this problem in terms of visibility and polygrouping and that kind of thing, you go down to one of the last menu options. It's the 4th or 5th from the bottom, called Display Properties. And you want to turn on double, so I can see the inside and outside of that mesh. So now I would hide that off, hit Control W, and now I've got my sort of tongue back. Now again, it's not the best looking boot, but I just kind of want to show you guys some of the fundamentals behind ZBrush. So back in geometry, right? So this is sort of a condensed typical workflow we might see in character production and props. Again, super simplified, but hopefully gives you a good idea of what you can do with ZBrush. Maybe I'll chop this in half. I can try to Zremesh again, and you can see I'm getting much simpler mesh, much cleaner mesh now. And we will get into more detailed versions of Zremesher as well. But what's great about this? The next sort of bridge to this is if you want to create clean, precise models, and you've got good topology, good mesh layout, we can now hit B for brush, Z for Z Modeler, and there's something called the Z Modeler brush. So the shortcut chain of commands is BZM, right? So anytime you see like alphabetical brushes, so let's say you go to C, and then there's like chisel or clay, so you can see, hit B for brush, C for clay, T for clay tubes, let's say, okay? For me personally, I usually take my top 10 brushes and just map them to 1 through 9 and 0. So let's go back to that B, Z, M for Z Modeler. This is a somewhat recent addition. I think it was in ZBrush 4R7, 4R8, so it's about 3-4 versions ago, about probably 5-6 years ago. They added this toolkit. So what does it allow you to do? Well, if you are hovering over an edge, you can actually add new edge loops. If you're hovering over a polygon or a 4-sided poly, you can extrude in or out. If you're hovering over a vertex, you just move points around basically. So it's B, Z, M, or Z Modeler brush, Z Modeler. So that's not Z-remeshing. I am working on a Z-remeshed model, but it is basically a polygon level editing tool, not necessarily a sculpting tool that works over dozens or hundreds or thousands of vertices and polygons, but it's more direct polygon editing, like a traditional Maya toolkit. So it allows you to quickly add edge loops, allows you to quickly extrude, single polys, but that's a bit limited, right? Well, here's the thing. So you have to sort of decide what your target is. Are you going to edit edges first? If I say, yes, I'm going to edit edges, well, then you hold the space bar, and now you've got many, many options. You can actually bevel edges. So I can say I want to bevel. So the first section is your action for edges, so it's edge actions. The second is the type of target. Do you want a single polygon, or a single edge, a single vertice, or a bunch of vertices, a bunch of edges? So this one's doing a full edge. So if I want to bevel, let's say, this loop, I click on it, and you see it bevels it and creates a new polygroup. If I hold space, I can do extrude, so I can extrude an edge. From an edge, sorry. If I pick up, so that's doing a single edge. I can say, let's do a complete edge loop. So here we can actually extrude that out for some sort of design feature in the boot, right? So again, this is beyond just the basic sculpting. It really allows you a lot of powerful editing tools. So QMesh is kind of like, how do I explain it? It's basically like an extrude, and then if you extrude next to it, it'll actually snap to that, and then you can pull a bit further and just do another extended extrude, okay? But let's say you want to extrude a whole polygroup. So I want to take this polygroup. So let's say I want to take this polygroup up top, let's say for now, and delete it. Hover over a polygon, and you'll see it'll say QMesh a poly, and then hit the spacebar. And again, we've got polygon actions, we've got polygon targets, and there's a whole variety of targets, and then a bunch of modifiers. Now I know this seems really scary and intimidating, but honestly, you're probably going to use maybe half a dozen to a dozen functions and maybe vary the targets 2 or 3 different ways. At least for my work right now, that's all I'm really doing. So let's say I want to delete, not a single poly, but I want to delete a whole polygroup. So that's holding the space bar. So now if I click on that, it deletes that polygroup inside there. And again, if I want to go to display, I'm going to make sure I'm on double-sided display so I can sort of see into the inside of the thin mesh. So again, if you're hovering a vertex, an edge, or a polygon, depending on which one you're in, and you hold space, it then gives you a series of actions. So there's this thing called, I think it's split. Split can give you almost like a circular-like opening. So if you wanted like little eyelets for the boot, boom, 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 you can go down the boot that way.
Those are edge options?
That's vertex option. So I went over point, and I think the default is in move, and you can set it to split. And again, you can set it to a point or a ring. I'm not really sure what the ring will do. I guess it's going to extend further out. Again, I don't use all these tools all the time, so I tend to use kind of the same basic tools over and over again. Anything I can't do in ZBrush, I will tend to just send over to Maya to quickly do it. And I believe if we hold Control, or is it Shift? I can't remember. Yeah. A couple of steps, though, I just want to show you guys. So let's say instead of this, I want to just push this area in for the tongue. I'm going to go into, I guess, Extrude. And again, when I hit Extrude, it's only set to extrude a single poly, but I want to affect a whole polygroup. So I'm going to take that and push it inwards, let's say.
How did you do that?
Or maybe I'll do a bevel. Let's try a bevel. Polygroup. There we go. Oh, it's being very weird. I'll try QMesh. Polygroup. Yeah, sometimes, you know, the functions aren't always great, but yeah. In this case, it's actually leaving a face behind, so I'm getting some kind of broken mesh, but so I hovered over Polygon, and you can go to either Extrude or QMesh, and then select Polygroup All. In this case, I'm going to undo. I think what I may need to do first is to do what's called an inset. So I'm going to show you guys what that does. An inset is kind of like a flat extrusion. So I'll do Polygroup, Inset, Polygroup, okay? And I want to do Inset Region, but I'm going to show you what it's saying down here at the bottom. It's actually going to inset each and every polygon into its own little space. So you want to make sure you set it to Inset Region. It's a very tricky one, but there.
Wait, so it's inset, polygroup all, and inset
Yeah, so I'm just holding space, so I'm hovering over a polygon, holding the space bar, going to Inset, and then Polygroup All. And my last modifier is basically to inset the region. So that will kind of give you a little secure border. And then what I could do is maybe take the Move brush. By the way, if you're in Move, Scale, or Rotate, remember this, if you Control-click on a polygroup, it will isolate just that group. So we can kind of move it down and in a bit. Yeah, so I'll Control, click, and drag to clear the mask. So, you know, there's little things that we do have to be aware of. So let's say I want to delete those top two little polys. I'll just literally hide them. And there's another way to delete mesh that's been hidden. You can actually just go into Geometry, Modify Topology, Delete Hidden. This is another button I use all the time. So in my custom interface, I have that button laid out very clearly somewhere. Okay, one last step. So let's say we want to make the base of the boot. I'm going to, again, hover over a polygon, hold space, go to Extrude, make sure it's Extrude Polygon All. And we can extrude that out. And then, because this side, it doesn't look like a different group, but it technically is actually. So this is a polygroup here. This side one is another polygroup. So if I just take the side and actually extrude that out, I now get the base of a boot. Okay, so I hope this sort of shows you guys the power of you know, doing conceptual modeling, getting basic shapes, merging them together. So you can do that with Dynamesh and do it kind of roughly in a way, and then you can Zremesh with those same polygroups that come from maybe the original shapes or from ones that you've made to make a cleaner kind of mesh. Okay, and what's great about this is that if you want to preview how this might look in Maya, there's a couple ways to do that. We can just use the standard division inside. Right, so that's just hitting divide, divide. And I probably mentioned this before, but ZBrush has a Maya-style preview tool, which is called Dynamic Subdivision. So this one you don't see, you won't be able to sculpt it at high resolutions, but it's more of a preview of what the mesh would look like when you hit 3 on your keyboard in Maya. And so one last thing we can do, if we want to see harder edges or creases, so let's say, you know, it rounds these edges out, right? From the boot, if I hover over edge, hold space and go to crease and say crease edge loop complete, and if I click on it, you'll see that edge gets creased now. So why does that matter? Well, when you hit dynamic, that edge is going to look much sharper, right? So if I do the same thing down here, while I'm in that sort of smooth preview, crease that, okay? So you can get these really, really kind of cool looking crease lines. So maybe I'll do one right at the base of where the leather or whatever meets the bottom of the boot, put a crease in there, and then turn on my dynamic subdivision. So it looks really, really sharp and clean, right? So we can go along and crease the loops around, you know, where our kind of boot comes into the tongue. Again, this isn't the cleanest or neatest, but I just want to show you guys kind of the basic functionality of polygroups and some direct polygon editing, which might be a more traditional way to work. Now, as a side benefit to this, you know, you can always regroup these polygroups, by the way, right? So I can say, you know what, I'm going to actually hide off, let's say, this part of the boot, because I want the whole bottom to be its own group, for example. So maybe I'll hit Control W. So just that bottom group is its own group now. You can go to Z Plugin, UV Master, turn on Polygroups, and with one click or 2 clicks, essentially get an unwrap based on those polygroups. And if you want to see it kind of laid out in UV space, again, ZBrush is a bit weird. It doesn't have its own typical UV editor, but you can work on a clone copy of this model. So when I click on clone, it actually puts me right into the clone, which is CL. I can go to flatten, and guess what? There's my UVs for the boot. So from concept modeling to a clean mesh or cleaner mesh to more controlled mesh to UVs, I think ZBrush just gives you a ton of control. Sure. Yep, so just to go over the UVs again, Z Plugin, UV Master, and you literally just turn on Polygroups and hit Unwrap. That's it. So that's basically the process. So like I said, that's one of the advantages I find is so amazing about ZBrush is that it's just so much faster. You're freer to work, freer to design, do more conceptual things. And you can also still get a really good degree of control like you would inside of something like Maya, but inside of ZBrush with ZModeler.